Hey everyone, welcome to Real Men Connect, the online discipleship community just for men, where we connect good men to godly men, helping them connect with successful husbands, strong leaders, and great fathers. Now, excuse the lighting on this because the sun is at my back. It's actually a very cold day here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. But I want to do a real man drive along real quick to address a very serious topic. And this, I guess I'll probably categorize this under the Ask a Real Man question, because I'd love to get your feedback on what your thoughts are. But I would say almost every week I have someone my wife knows that we know who's usually going through a very traumatic time. I mean, it could be medical diagnosis of cancer, the death of a loved one, a very rough financial patch, and I think you can relate to that, where it just seems like life is hitting them from all sides. And I'm not telling you that I'm immune from that, because I've gone through it myself. But it seems like almost every week, I mean almost every other day, I hear a story of someone who's really going through a very hard time in their life. And of course, as a man and as a Christian, we're often the go-to person to give them comfort and advice and encouragement. But what do you say to someone who has just received a diagnosis of cancer? What do you say to someone who just tell you that they lost their mother or their spouse just passed away? What do you say to someone who tells you that they've now had to file for bankruptcy and they may be getting evicted or kicked out of their house? Well, without being cliche or being trite, and this is very important, that the advice that I normally give to people is I do not minimize their pain and their suffering. And I think that's one of the worst things you can do, is to minimize their pain and suffering. I think also one of the worst things you can do is tell them that you understand if you haven't gone through it yourself. So I'm telling you what you can't do or what you shouldn't do, but what should you do? Well, normally when someone approaches me or they ask me or shares with me some traumatic experience that they're going through, I start with the basics. Now, I don't tell them this, the basics, but I start with the basics, and I remind them, one, of who they are in Christ, because it's easy to lose your identity and who you are when you're caught in the middle of your circumstances, and you get overwhelmed by the trials and tribulations of life. So one, I remind them of who they are in Christ, because God is very specific on who we are. And so that kind of leads to the next thing that I also do. After I remind them of who they are in Christ, I remind them of what God said. And that kind of goes in line with identity, because we know who we are in Christ, that there's no condemnation of those who are in Jesus Christ, that we are new creatures if we are in Christ. But then I remind them of what God said, of the promises that He would never leave nor forsake us, that all things work together for good. Now, again, this may not ease the pain, but they still need to be reminded of who they are in Christ and what God said, and reminded of His promises. And last but certainly not least, I remind them of what God has already done. And this is huge. So many times as we go through life, we get what I call spiritual amnesia. We forgot how far God has already brought us from. And if all you have to do is look back and check God's resume, and you look back at your life, you will realize that God has brought you through a lot, even to this point. And sometimes what you're going through currently may seem like the worst thing you've ever gone through. But if you take a moment to stop and think, there were a lot of times when you thought you weren't going to even continue with life and go on, because the pain was so great, that breakup, that death of a loved one, that lost opportunity, whatever it may be. But you look back now and you realize that God was right there the whole time, and He brought you through it. And so checking God's resume and being reminded of what He's already done usually gives us the strength to persevere and to keep going. And so I try to get them focused on those three things. One, who God said they are, who they are in Christ. Two, remind them of what God said and remind them of His promises. And three, last but certainly not least, remind them of what God has already done. Now, of course, beyond that, you can pray for them. You can send them scriptures of encouragement. You can take care of needs that you know they won't even ask you about taking care of, whether it be grocery shopping for them. You don't ask them, what can I do? You just do it. You know their life. You know what they're going through. You know what needs to be done. They need the kids to be picked up from school. They may need someone to watch the kids while they're doing something. It doesn't matter. It could be they don't feel like cooking, so you take them a meal or whatever. But you just be very intentional and attentive to their needs. But it all starts with the Word. And the last thing that I will also suggest as even an extra, and this is something that I do personally, in addition to reminding who I am in Christ and remembering what God said and what He's done, I also make my world smaller. And when I say I make my world smaller, when I make my world smaller, that means God becomes bigger. Now, what I mean by smaller is that I stop thinking about tomorrow. I stop thinking about next week. I stop thinking about next month or next year, because a lot of time the pressure and the pain comes from how we don't know how we're going to deal with a lot of the trauma after it happens. So my thing is to make my world smaller. When I mean make my world smaller, that means think about what I'm thankful for today in this moment. I have a saying that if you take life beat by beat, breath by breath, moment by moment, step by step, that you can endure almost anything. And so when I make my world smaller, God becomes bigger. So I'm not worried about tomorrow. I'm worried about the next breath. I'm not even worried about the next hour. I'm thanking God for daily bread. And also I made a deal with God years ago that I told him that I'll worry about it after it happens. Because a lot of times we worry about things before they happen, but I told God I will worry about it after it happens. And guess what I found out? 9 times out of 10, the thing that you thought was going to happen never does. So that's the Real Man Ride Along, and the Ask a Real Man question for the day or for the week. But if I would like to know your insights, what do you do? How do you comfort someone in times of need when they're going through a traumatic experience? Please share your comments down below. And as always, remember, a man is a terrible thing to waste, and that we're males by birth, but we become men by choice. Stay in His grip, and God bless.